Hey to all metal maniacs, welcome once more for another video on the Iron Horde channel. And the journey throughout different regions in the world doesn't stop, and from last week's video about heavy metal in Latin America, we travel all the way to the other side of the world, to the land known for kangaroos, koalas and the Sydney Opera House, to the land that bears the name of Australia. Needless to say, there are numerous bands throughout the 80s who have left a mark on the scene, and we are going to go through these albums as usual and define what impact they had both artistically and culturally. So, like I always say, grab your favorite beer and off we go to the land down under. Let's go! Thanks for joining us again for this video. If you are new here, the aim of this channel is to review albums and festivals such as bands, delve in the cultural aspect of heavy metal in general and more. So if you're interested in this content, please consider supporting this channel by subscribing, liking and sharing our videos on social media. As I've been researching in the past few days about the history of the Australian hard rock and heavy metal scene in the late 70s and early 80s, I started seeing a lot of similarities with the British early years of the new wave of British heavy metal. Bands starting out in pubs, playing to a few people of that particular area, meeting in record stores, etc. Whilst I was reading, it just gave off so much of the influence the UK has on the way of approaching entertainment, and being a former colony, there is a lot of cultural heritage which is obviously shared between both countries. Stores such as Melbourne's Metal for Melbourne were instrumental in the development of Australian metal bands in the 70s and 80s, pushing for bands like Theramis, Taipan and Bengal Tigers to get obviously some recognition. This also led to some Metal for Melbourne gigs between 1981 and 86 that were especially important for young bands with members under 18 who couldn't get into pubs. Utopia Records in Sydney was likewise important to the early scene in terms of centrality and influence, and provided a getaway for many Australian bands to access international acts through tape trading and vice versa, of course. This simultaneous connection to and isolation from the rest of the world characterizes a lot of Australian metal. It costs a lot of money to get all your gear over there, so most of the international acts that made it to Australia were the really huge big ones like Kiss or Metallica. Tape trading provided some access to the international underground, but many people speaking of the period from the 70s to the late 80s describe feeling fairly cut off from the rest of the world. There have been successive waves of migration to Australia from all over the world throughout the years, meaning that it is quite hard to identify something unique and original as Australian culture. It's truly pretty multicultural, especially in the major cities such as Sydney and Melbourne. It's from this musical context, and even from some of these same bands, that the beginnings of Aussie metal come from. Of some note is the fact that a large majority of these bands are from Melbourne, as I said, with a few bands from Adelaide, Sydney and Perth in the mix as well. So here we go with today's list, obviously as usual starting from the latest record, moving on to the earliest one. From 1989 I bring you the album Pity of Man by the band Addictive, released with Survival Records. I remember discovering this album through another Australian thrash band which I will mention later on, and being immediately hooked from the very first notes on the very first track, Get Out of My Life. Addictive play a kind of dark brand of thrash featuring a strong Slayer influence, though it actually comes off as quite Germanic sounding at times, reminding of Creator and Sodom getting together and decided that belting out some American thrash riffs would be fun for a change. It's remarkably well executed as well, melodic riff work meets brutal chugs and the occasional Sodom-esque shriek with constantly hard-hitting drum work as well. Essentially, it's everything thrash should have. The great thing on this record is that every song flows into the next without at all sounding similar. All the songs have distinctive trademarks, from The Forge and its melodic main riff to What World Are You In and its powerful thrashing chugs. Whether it's a particularly catchy riff, a Megadeth style bass line like in Echoes of the Mind, every song on Pity of Men will hook you in some way. The lead work is absolutely jaw-dropping, nothing technical, just blazing solo and distinctive lead sections all throughout the album that sound closer to early Metallica or Megadeth. The track My Foe in particular is representative of this. The lead work is absolutely stunning. The track as a whole is much slower than the rest of the album, and it is the closest Addictive come to a ballad. In between the guitar riffs and jaw-dropping leads flows great acoustic work. The song really shows how diverse this album is, while once again remaining cohesive throughout. There's nothing innovative or new about Pity of Men, but then most people who will listen to this album aren't really going to be looking for that. If you just want 40 minutes of thrash gasmic fun and the sore neck afterwards, Addictive is what you are looking for. Favorite track is What World Are You In? Next in line is the album Let Us Pray by the band Nothing Sacred, released in 1988 by Cleopatra Records. We remain more or less in the thrash metal world with this record. Well, actually we are more in the speed metal world here. From the opening track Warhead, one can immediately notice the new wave of British heavy metal influences here, especially from the UK band with the same name as their first track, Warhead. Other influences like Raven, Tank, Atomcraft, Holocaust, and last but not least, the legendary Motorhead. This is the kind of dirty, raw, filthy metal that was so common in the UK in the early 80s, with that kind of punkish attitude. The music on here really guides me towards those roots. The tracks Ser Magma and Damage are a bit more mellow, relatively speaking, but the rest are full on speed ahead, no prisoners taken, whiskey-induced heavy metal. As is common with these types of albums, production could be better, but on the other hand this DIY punkish feel, which I mentioned earlier and which I feel aids the overall feel of the album, can be mainly attributed to the production. I've also repeated from previous videos, I wouldn't change it for a better and clearer production, as this would destroy the soul of this record. Tracks are short, to the point. In fact, the album clocks at around 35 minutes. Other highlight tracks are This Is War, Let Us Pray and Guardian, with my favorite being Gods of War. If you're into that kind of punk metal music, then this is the one for you. Definitely a pioneering album with regards to the Australian metal scene. The third album on the list is Veil of Morn by the band Rampage, released in 1988 with Quasi production. Still remaining in the speed thrash sounds, which as you can see from the first three records on here, occupied most of Australia's second part of the 80s decade. Whilst the first one is full on thrash, the second one is more of a new wave of British heavy metal with speed album. This one holds some progressive elements within it, kind of early Watchtower for those who have followed that band. The range of influences result in an album which is quite diverse in scope, but also very straightforward and tough. Some have labeled the Rampage as a progressive speed, which is sort of accurate, although they never succumb to pure wankery or virtuosic overconfidence. The songs are full of brutal shredding, pounding drums and bass that actually propels the music, but underneath lurks a sense of subtlety usually lacking in the style. Rhythmic shifts and tempo changes abound, speedy thrash parts give way to soaring melodies, and jamming is an integral part of the trio's sound. I suppose the level of experimentation can be somewhat likened to an early Megadeth record, where technicality and diversity of style never subtracted from the brutal onslaught. The production is pretty good for a self-released album, but sounds very much a product of its time. The guitars are sharp and thin, the bass is clearly audible but is lacking in the low-end department, and the drums in true 80s fashion sound enormous and soaked in reverb. Vocalist-guitarist George Mitrov does have an impressive range instead of the usual thrash vocalists that stick to one style. His unique accent giving him a sound of his own, he completely switches from snarling growls to a powerful, clean singing devoid of power metal cheese with some falsetto parts thrown in. After the release of this record, Mitrov discovered Christianity and preferred to focus on that, and abruptly quit shortly after, leaving the band and album dead in its tracks. In the end, I decided to include this record because it has some unique elements to it, and it is not the usual run-of-the-mill thrash to speed metal record. Highlight tracks are Divine Oracle, Sinister at Sunrise, and Autopsy, with the favorite of the lot for me being Acid Storm. Next is one of Australia's most notorious musicians, and I'm referring to Peter Hobbs and his band Hobbs Angel of Death, with their debut self-titled record released with Steam Hammer. Peter Hobbs was originally with the band Tyrus, which was a 4-piece hard rock heavy metal band and covered a range of heavy metal classics from Priest to Sabbath. Tyrus also included in their sets a number of raw originals that later became some of Angel of Death's work. In fact, their sound throughout the years became much thrashier, and eventually the band disbanded and Peter Hobbs founded Hobbs Angel of Death in 1987. This debut record has remained somewhat unknown outside of the underground scene, but it is one of those records that brims with passion, power and attitude. This album goes along the same journey as Old School Slayer, Dark Angel and other more extreme thrash metal acts from the US, but it has its own unique place within the greats of 80s thrash. Hobbs Angel of Death is on the slower side of the thrash metal spectrum, but don't let the speed fool you. While it might not be as fast as others of the genre, it certainly makes up with full-on aggression, with Peter Hobbs' unique vocals and the slow, aggressive guitars make for an eerie atmosphere along the lines of Celtic Frost's first couple of albums. From the very beginning till the end, you are hit with a wall of thrash. This is one album with no weak tracks, a testament to the hard work and perseverance of Peter Hobbs. Unfortunately, in the 20-odd years Hobbs Angel of Death has been around, they have only put out 3 albums. Hopefully, as time goes on, people will start to remember Hobbs Angel of Death's contribution to the thrash metal scene, especially to that of Australia, as he is one of the pioneers of the extreme metal of that region. Peter Hobbs unfortunately passed away in 2019, but his music and passion definitely lives on. Some of my favorite tracks on here are Lucifer's Domain, House of Death and Jack the Ripper, but my absolute favorite would be Satan's Crusade. 5th album on this list, and it comes from quite possibly the most famous heavy metal band ever from Australia. Needless to say, I'm referring to the band Mortal Sin, and on this list I decided to include their debut record called Mayhemic Destruction, released in 1987 with Mega Metal Records. I remember discovering Mortal Sin through a guy I had met at one of my frequent foreign fests I have attended. He had their t-shirt on, so I inquired about the band, and once he mentioned the name and how good they were, I took note of that. At the first chance I got, I immediately went out to check them out. And when the first few notes of this album went on, I knew immediately that I would be listening to this record a whole lot. Interestingly enough, the album starts with an instrumental. I don't think I've ever encountered something similar. It feels like a very long intro in reality. And then once the second track kicks in, we get introduced to Matt Moorer's vocals, which are unusual and somewhat nasal, but still give off the US thrash vocal approach throughout the album. Mortal Sin had only played live 6 times when they went in to record this album in July of '86. Released 6 months later, Mayhemic Destruction captures the essence of the embryonic Australian thrash metal scene in its minimalist production values and the immediacy of its delivery. As Australia's first major metal release, this album is as important today as it was when it first appeared. If there is one band that is really similar to Mortal Sin, for me that would be Early Artillery. But what you get here is also a lot of Metallica influence and also some early Creator vibe. The musicianship here is competent, the bassist is a true driving force, as are guitarists Paul Karwan and Keith Kristen, with their heavy and powerful riffs surely to get your head moving, and the solos here are also done very well, taking a similar approach to Testament. Drumming duty is competent, although nothing extraordinary. It's what it should be for thrash metal, although there isn't much double bass action here as well. An interesting fact for me and those fellow countrymen and women following this video is that along the years, Mortal Sin have had numerous musicians with a Maltese heritage. The already mentioned Paul Caruana, but also musicians such as Troy Sherry, Mick Sultana and Joe Buttigieg. The latter two were also involved in the Addictive album I mentioned earlier in this video. In fact, a number of Maltese emigrated to Australia in the 60s, so no wonder every now and then I encounter a Maltese surname in some of these bands. National pride aside, this album is a staple for every thrash maniac. Tracks like Woman in Leather, Blood, Death, Hatred, and the somewhat thrash death black metalish title track Mayhemic Destruction. My favorite though would be Lebanon, with that Middle Eastern intro which leads into some frantic relentless riffing. It's just an amazing track. Next record is a bit of an odd record, not because it's not a good record, on the contrary, but because it absorbs its influences from different metal subgenres and kind of molds them as its own. The album is Queen of Thieves by the band Theramis, released in 1987 with Metal for Melbourne Records. This is actually a phenomenal progressive power thrash metal release and would definitely appeal to fans of early Fates Warning, Queensryche, even Savatage, I might say. Now, in saying that, I will readily admit that they were not at the cutting edge of progressive metal with this release, and the influences I mentioned, and even those of Iron Maiden as well, can be quite blatant at times, but this record still holds its own identity in the underground metal scene. When it comes to crazy and non-repetitive arrangements, these guys were without parallel in Australia for their time and genre. Choruses are generally brief, except for the songs that lack them completely. If that was indeed their aim, the decision to put Lord of the Black Fields as opener was a good one, which goes through so many different sections, from syncopated stop-start intensity to seemingly dissonant wave-like chords over contrasting drive to classic power metal melody to intense shred-filled aggression, and all this happens in the first 3.5 minutes of the album. In fact, while instrumentally this album is very strong to begin with, it is in the many breaks throughout that the late Dave Brown makes what I want to call one of the strongest traditional metal drumming performances ever. He is incredibly active on the kit and has a sense of swing that is rarely found in 80s metal, let alone the more melodic power metal type. He uses the double bass with all this speed to impress your average thrasher, but just listen to how he can play a speed metal shuffle in the main lead section of part of Aquilonia. The also now past Clive Bear, especially on Killers, was without doubt an inspiration here, but with not the slightest disrespect to that also godly drummer, the performance here is far more complex and involved. I don't know the musical background of the drummer, but I'd be surprised if he didn't begin his playing career outside of metal, kind of classic or jazz to a certain extent. The band doesn't neglect to incorporate a more triumphant and warlike confidence either. This is where the Fates Warning influence is strongest. That particularly aggressive form of power metal where the note progressions are almost in the same form of later extreme metal, but are decidedly fully rooted in traditional power, in actual rhythm, if that makes any sense. The bassist is incredibly strong at backing the riffs here, and while he doesn't deviate much from the main progressions, he already shows very strong tightness and stamina. The Chosen is the heaviest song to be found here along those lines, and also features some of the most detailed vocal melodies. But this album isn't just rhythm and attack. In fact, the moody and fantastical melodic parts make just as large of a presence here, even if they aren't always quite as developed. This also contributes to the track My Life being the odd song out, a pretty straightforward, albeit strongly enjoyable ballad. However, when they crank up the distortion, they attain a kind of murky and obscure harmony on par with even Irei Melanox, the album by Adramelch, which I had included in the Italian Essential Albums video. The effect is beautifully haunting at times, the tremolo picked riff in the title track and the washing of high reverb to delicate acoustic ones in Wolves being great example of this. Altogether, Theramis' marriage of arcane power metal with a more 70s hard rocking rhythm and swagger is something I cannot easily find elsewhere. While yes, they have their obvious influences, this could not be further away from being mediocre. My favorite track here would be the already mentioned Path to Aquilonia. As you can see, we started with the trashier albums and we are now slowly moving towards a more classic heavy metal sound. Theramis was already a drastic change from the bands I mentioned earlier, but still retained some of those thrash parts, and this shows the progression of the sound within the Australian heavy metal scene. Next record is Life on Earth by the band Trilogy, released independently in 1985. I have always thought about this record as a mix of new wave of British heavy metal and Rush. The latter influence is mainly in John Ryder's vocals, very similar to Geddy Lee of Rush. John Ryder, who is also known for his time with the more famous hard rock band Rose Tattoo. One of those records that gives off such a satisfying and relaxed feel. There is a certain smoothness to the music, the bass sound is very central to the music. Just listen to the bass solo on the track The Hammer. It even has that sporadic use of keyboards, which is also an important element to the music here. Every now and then you can hear that heavy guitar riff which kind of surprises you and breaks off that progressive momentum on which this record is built. This can be particularly heard on the track Rough Time. This is one of those records that has a more accessible sound, which should have had a much bigger impact in the European and the US market. Highlight tracks for me here are Fight Like the Devil, Life on Earth and Pariah, whilst my favorite would be the already mentioned Rough Time. Moving on, and the next record is from 1984, and I bring you the self-titled debut and only record by the band Surrender, released independently. What we have here is a more melodic approach to heavy metal. When I first heard this record, the obvious influence to me was Dio's solo records. The synth parts dominate in this record, which really create that 80s nostalgic feel. Just listen to the intro to the track Technical Air Fantasy. It is like the soundtrack of an action movie or a video game. Then the guitar follows with a somewhat oriental vibe to it, which actually makes this my favorite track on this record. Come to think of it, it really has also an obvious rainbow influence as well. The vocals remind me a lot of Joe Lynn Turner and Robert Tepper, and even from mentioning these two vocalists you will somewhat get an idea of what the music is all about. The track So You Run has some 80s Scorpions and Motley Crue touches as well, so as you can see there's a good mix of 80s music here with some high caliber references, and considering this was released in '84, I believe this record has a rightful place in this list, as it was one of the first of its kind within the Australian scene. From my research I actually found that it is quite an overlooked record, but having listened to it on a number of occasions, this record definitely deserves more attention. Other highlight tracks are the slower Funny Man, Just Couldn't Take It, and Feelings. Remaining in 1984 with the album Step On It by the band Boss, released with RCA Records. Boss is a straight up hard rock heavy metal Motley Crue worship, bringing in the attitude and old school denim and leather approach with beer and women. This basically is Motley Crue but better. This is what Crue should have or could have been if they played some heavier stuff and kept focusing more on the music rather than the image. In fact, the music is very hard rock oriented, but obviously inclined with a traditional heavy metal sense, including some typical 80s shredding, very Van Halen-esque, and a lot of crunchy riffs akin to that of AC/DC or Skid Row, with a pounding rhythmic section combined with the simple beats of the bass and drums, and vocals which are very similar to those of Mark Storace from Crocus. The opener, Kick-Ass Rock and Roll, is a great song featuring some decent lead guitar work and a catchy as hell chorus. That's what this whole music style is focusing on, being catchy and writing songs that make you stand up and pump your fist in the air while chanting along. As much as I despise most of the glam metal bands in existence, Boss does a decent job of making themselves more than that, with each song being somewhat worthy of listening to instead of having one or two singles that are just catchy numbers while the rest kind of fades away. Songs like SKP and Hard and Fast are just straight up simple songs that are somewhat fist pumping and catchy. The musicianship here is competent but nothing special as per what you would expect from a hard rock heavy metal band from the early 80s with a glam side. It has some decent lead guitar work that shreds it up when necessary, but in the end it's nothing you wouldn't find in most other records. When your fix of cheesy 80s styled hard rock heavy metal kicks in, then this is one of those go-to records. Much better than the other more famous heavy glam acts for sure. Favorite track would be Freewheelin'. And the last album on this list is Endangered Species by the band Black Alice, released in 1983 with Street Tunes Records. This album brings forth a sound akin to AC/DC with influences of Accept and Judas Priest. From the first time I heard this record, I've always had a strange sensation which I never could kind of attribute to something specific. Sometimes the structures of the track seems a bit odd and the production is quite raw as well. All of this brings that kind of unique charm to it as well. This music bears a great amount of untamed energy and they were able to build some excellent melodies. Okay, their music formula is the very same of countless other bands of those same years, but they could have been a success if they had better conditions and distribution in Europe and the US, because this album holds a lot of potential, and considering it is from '83, a time when metal was just crawling up from the depths of the underground, this could have definitely reached a wider audience, although truth be told, this record lacks those potential hits that are needed to have an ongoing radio presence. Having said that, these guys really know how to make some excellent choruses and harmonic structures, with vocals that are a mix between Udo Dirkschneider of Accept and Brian Johnson of AC/DC. Songs like No Warning, with its simple melodies, the hard rock energy shown on Ratcatcher's Eyes, the catching guitar riffs and the arrangements on Hell Has No Fury, the slow rhythm of In the Hall of the Ancient Kings, the aggressive melodies that are present on Roll the Dice, and the heavyweight shown on Blade of Slaughter are proof of a very good name that deserved better luck, but it wasn't the case. So now it is your turn to give this record a chance. I did, and I found myself going back to it quite often, especially when I'm in my car. One of those perfect records to play whilst you're behind the wheel. Favorite track on here would be Roll the Dice. So that brings to a close another list of records, which I hope will bring you hours of listening pleasure. I sure had a lot of fun revisiting some of these records which I hadn't listened to for some time, and reconfirming how great they are. It's quite something to see the evolution of the music here, as I have already mentioned earlier. Even if this progression happened a bit later compared to the European and the US scene, it still brings to light some unique ideas and sounds which make the Australian scene stand out from other regions of the world. As always, I have left out plenty of other bands, but it is up to you now to write them down in the comments below if you feel they deserve to be included here. I'm sure there are bands which I haven't discovered yet myself, so give me more music to listen to as well. Reminder as usual to subscribe, like, click the bell and share our videos on social media. Help us out in sharing the word of heavy metal and the word of these underground bands to a wider audience. Also use the affiliate links in the description. We get a small commission at no extra expense for you, the buyer. You can buy any product from those links, not necessarily the one we have linked. So see you at our next video on Wednesday. Stay safe and metal on. Cheers!